Thanks. So thank you, Ben. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's nice to be here. It's an amazing institute. You know, I've read many of the publications in the past, and I'm honored to be here. I'm here not to speak so much about Nostromo, more about dispatchable load shift, but I will just give a couple of slides about what we do so people have the context. And then I have a few vintage slides from PG&E. You can sell them on eBay. And then we'll dive into dispatchable load shift. So, you know, a lot of things here that I'll say probably really known here at the Institute. You know, buildings consume 74% of the electricity, but air conditioning is, at peak hours, is 30 to 70% of this load. So if we could make that load flexible, we could really solve most of the grid problems, because peak times are what we're building the grid for. That's what we're building for, and air conditioning, if we solve that air conditioning problem, we could solve it. So, you know, also back from my PG&E days, there's this very dichotomic look at front of the meter versus behind the meter assets. So the grid is used to, and PG&E is used to building things in front of the meter, you know, whether it's traditional generation, but now intermittent renewables like solar and wind, and then even energy storage. It's very convenient for the utilities and regulators to think about it from the front of the meter perspective. It's controllable, it's big assets, they can dispatch them, they know what they get, they can measure them. It's all nice and fine. But behind of the meter storage or assets are very interesting. If you could, because right, the grid need to balance the demand and supply all the time. If we could do that, then we could also solve this problem. So Nostromo is a company that focuses on behind the meter, and we do behind the meter storage, and we do it with ice. So we developed a technology called the IceBrick. It's a first storage cell that's modular. So each cell stores approximately 6 to 10 kilowatt hours, and we'll build systems that are very large, like 100 IceBricks or more. And what we are able to do is, for a large building, we'll store cold energy in forms of ice, and then we'll cool the building with that ice at a later time. And then, if you think about a big building like this, or even bigger, in the summer, at peak time, 70% of its electricity is air conditioning. So we can take that whole load and move it to a different time of the day. So now, let's say it's 5 p.m. and no solar around, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I can power this building with ice that I stored instead of drawing electricity from the grid. So that's what Nostromo does. And we're able to retrofit buildings like this anywhere. So their technology is very much applicable anywhere, right? Because almost in a certain area, all buildings have air conditioning. So this is an example of a system we built at the Beverly Hilton in Beverly Hills. So it's just to give an example, it's a 1950s circa building. It's very high end. And we went in and retrofit the building with a 1.3 megawatt hour storage system. So this is a big deal because you wouldn't be able to retrofit that building with like a battery because of concerns of safety issues inside an urban area. But with ice, we just put ice in the basement, so what can happen, right? So that's not a concern. But it's very effective in form that we can take that huge cooling load for that building and shift it around the clock. So it's interesting. It can be done. I come into the Bay Area, or here in the Bay Area quite a lot, Sacramento. You drive around the 101, you look at all these buildings. And the first thing I think about when I see all those nice buildings, none of them have storage. So that opportunity of equipping large buildings with energy storage is there, and I'll talk to that. So now I'm going to move on to talk about demand response background. I used to manage PG&E's demand response program portfolio maybe 12 years ago. So I actually took slides from that time. So these are some vintage slides from that time. So I'm not sure how many of the people on the webinar are familiar with demand response. But the idea of demand response, if we look at the load of, of a grid, this is a full kind of PG&E grid back at the time, you can see that it almost doubles in the summer month. So this is the full year kind of hourly load of the PG&E grid. And you can see, the weekends, right? You can see 52 weeks here if you look closely at this graph. And you can see the summer month and all that. Now there's a very interesting curve called the load duration curve, where we take all these hours, instead of putting them in order of the calendar, we put them in order from large to small, okay? So it will look like this. And this is called the load duration curve. So if we now reorder those hours and we look at how much energy they're using, we find out very interesting things. We find out that, the top back then, the top 100 hours represent only 1.3, they're only 1.3 of the total hours in the year, but they're 12% of the load. So if you think about it, when I'm building a grid, I need to balance that load at any time. So I'm building load for those 100 hours that's being used, just 1.3% of the time. And that was the big opportunity that demand response, promised in the last 30 years. They said, okay, instead of building generation for those 100 hours, let's work with our customers to reduce their load in those 100 hours. So we have this kind of peaked event philosophy that says that's the goal of demand response. We want to prevent the building of the marginal power plant. Okay, so again, going from this to this, that's the promise of demand response. And in the typical demand response programs, and they still exist today, and they haven't changed much, by the way, you have all these components of like how much you're reducing, and what's the contract period, and who's eligible, and what's the trigger for calling them, and how many hours do they respond. So we call them event-based programs. And there's hundreds of programs like this around the world. And they're typically like three-letter acronyms like CBP or BIP or one of those, DBP. There's hundreds of those. And again, they did what they did. That was their goal. And this is what's called, this is traditional demand response. And they still work. Now, what I want to introduce today, and this is why I'm here, I want to introduce a new concept, which I call dispatchable load shift. And I'll claim it's a new kind of VPP. Now I took off my Nostromo hat, no more Nostromo. I'll talk about any kind of storage device that's in buildings. So, I was a student too once. So I'll give you the takeaways. We can do the takeaways and then go home, right? So my takeaways for this. So a few things that I'd like, to remember as students or researchers, is that the grid today has other problems. Okay, so one is we want to integrate renewables, and I'll show a lot of information about that. We can't build enough transmission distribution for the growing needs. So this has become so much more painful in the last 2 years with the growing needs of AI. We see states in the US that their electric grid needs to grow like double in the next few years. It's like crazy. It used to be like 3% growth, and now some grids are like just, they can't absorb all this growth. We want it to be affordable. It's a big deal, right? So all these projects become very expensive. And we want to electrify it, which will even further create problems, right? All these electrification projects, you want to add more, like move from gas to electrification. That adds a lot of other problems. And already, the US grid, and this is a number that not all the people are aware, is at 40% utilization. This is crazy. So the biggest infrastructure that we've built ever, like the electric grid, is used 40% on a nationwide scale. VPPs, people think about VPPs. We've been in conferences, they talk about residential devices. EVs, thermostats, that's great. But they're not only for residential devices. Let's think about how a commercial building can be part of a VPP. And I'll say that DLS, we think, solves a lot of these issues. So now that I gave you the takeaways, we're done. No, just kidding, let's start. So back in 2018, a friend of mine from PG&E, I met him on one of my trips, and he told me, Boaz, that demand response that I just described, that's only one type of demand response. LBNL defined 4 types of demand response. They give them funny names, like shape, shed, shift, and shimmy. I won't talk about shape and shimmy, but we just learned that what I described earlier is a shed kind of demand response. Why is it shed? Because I'm telling people or facilities, reduce their load. I'm going to ask you in the next 2 hours to do something, you're going to reduce your load. We would joke that the facility manager needs to run around the facility and start shutting down lights and shutting down an elevator and maybe set the temperature higher so the chillers don't work. So that's a shed kind of philosophy. Shift is something different. In shift, we don't ask necessarily to reduce load. We're just asking to move it around the clock. So a simple example will be you need to heat your water, and I'll ask you, instead of heating it at 6 p.m. because then the grid is stressed, heat it at 2 p.m. If you have a tank, the water heater is holding the water, and you can use it later, right? So it's a very simple shift technology, right? You didn't suffer. You didn't have less hot water. You just did it at a different time. Maybe there's a little bit of loss of efficiency there, right? Because if you need to heat it a little bit more to get it, hot enough until 6 p.m., but if your electricity at 2 p.m. was free or carbon-free, and your electricity at 6 p.m. is carbon-intensive and expensive, sounds like a good trade-off, right? So use storage there to do that. So shift, one of the main thing is that it shouldn't impact the customer as much, right? So if I come home and you tell me, I'm telling you I'm going to leave tomorrow morning, and tell me, okay, charge your EV at night or later on, I don't care when it's charged. I'm just moving it around the clock, right? So getting the same service at a different time. So shift is kind of a big idea, and it's a very different beast than shed. So what's happened is that this shift has been recognized, but it hasn't received its own treatment yet. So we're learning that it exists, but we haven't given it its own treatment. So let's talk about that a little bit. So that same study also found that in California alone, there's a potential of 9 gigawatts of shift. So 9 gigawatts of assets that are currently not participating in the game, that you could shift them around the clock. And my business is, again, sorry, a little bit, is commercial HVAC, just 3 gigawatts in commercial HVAC. So it's a huge opportunity that's on the table, that nobody's on the floor. Nobody's picking it up. And then the regulator, you mentioned this, Ben mentioned this, on SB 846, they said, oh, this shift is a good thing. We want 7 gigawatts of that by 2030. So they put on this goal, and it's kind of thought about where it will come from, but I must tell you that kind of following the market, this is challenging, let's say the least. We're not sure that we're going to be able to get to this goal at the moment with these tools that are in the toolbox. And I'm going to talk more about what are these tools are and how do we change them. So in terms of background, the main thing that changed since we established those DR programs back in 2009 is that we're relying a lot more on solar and intermittent renewables. And those don't work 24/7, so we have to store energy. And now I'm offering an idea, which is actually a little bit radical. I'm just going to look at my clock. Is that I'm going to ask, what was the goal of DR, and what should the goal be? So if I ask, and this is a very fundamental question, why are you doing demand response? Why? And the answer was, we saw that, it was peak reduction. We want to cut down those peaks and prevent the building of the marginal power plant. That was our goal. And that's still a lot of people, I think, believe that's the goal of demand response. But I would offer a different goal. I would say that I want to prevent the daily usage of the peaker power plants. So going back to this, we joke, right? California has an energy crisis every day. The sun sets, right? So the CAISO was just there last evening. The CAISO needs to ramp up like 20, not 20. So we'll see that chart in a second, but many peaker power plants. So I would say, why not try to reduce the amount of peaker power plants that we're ramping up every day? That should be our goal. Balancing that solar and that intermittency, maybe it's wind. So once we have the flexibility, we can balance all kinds of intermittent renewables every day, not only in marginal events. So this is a big deal. And I want to look at it through the loading order. I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's a concept that used to be kind of talked a lot about, but not revisited so much. And the loading order said, it's kind of a guiding principle for policy and regulatory work is, okay, given everything else equal, where should you try to get your energy from? And the loading order defined that the first thing that you want to do is energy efficiency, right? It's kind of like reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Is that the right word? Yeah, kind of like that, but for energy, right? So it's like, okay, first order of things is energy efficiency. So just duck curve real quick if people on the call are not familiar. The duck curve shows the daily load net of renewables. So basically this shows how much energy you need to provide to the grid. And basically it's after the renewables given their load, right? So the reason it goes like this is because in California we have so much solar that midday we actually don't need to produce, and sometimes we have extra energy, right? So first thing on the loading order is energy efficiency. So let's say we bring in more energy efficiency. What does it do to the duck curve? It takes it down, right? So depending on the hours, let's say it's sliding maybe more at night, let's say, but whatever, energy efficiency takes the duck curve down. Demand response, the kind that I explained about earlier, the shed demand response, it will kind of shave the head, but just a few events a year. Maybe we call it 5 times, maybe we call it 10 times a year. We'll do that. Renewable resources, especially solar, will kind of deepen the belly. So we are now at 28% solar. And we're already under the zero there. So what's going to happen when we're like at 40% solar? Okay, and we're at 60%, we're at 48 renewable integration as of now, and the goal is, I believe, 60% by 2030 and then 90% by 2035. So this is where we're at now. What's going to happen when we move even forward? So what I see kind of globally is that California is just 10 years ahead of the game. The duck curve is not a California thing. It's a California thing because we got there. Every state and every grid will have this duck curve phenomena. It's not unique to California. It's just that we're seeing the future because we're here. Now, this is the problem, right, that we see, as I mentioned, 28%. So the first problem we have with this duck curve here is that we're starting to curtail. So what do we do with this negative consumption? And the second problem, and I'll show you a better chart on this, is that this daily ramp up. This is crazy. Like, think about it. Like, try to think about this operator perspective. I'm at 3 p.m. All my production is shutting down because the sun is just starting to set. And I need to ramp up 23 gigawatts. Okay, so let's see it in kind of real world numbers. So this is the top chart is from August, so summer duck curve. The ramp up was, in this case, a 3-hour ramp up of 18 gigawatts. Okay, this is crazy, right? Putting up all these. And then the bottom one is just recently my founder at the company loves to follow this. So this is from January 20th, a new kind of 23 gigawatts ramp up in 3 hours. Again, that's like, if you think about a peaker power plant that's like 300 megawatts, I know that's like 65, 70-ish power plant, on, like you're running to get that done. So what we think, or what I think, is that if I could have a technology that every day, charges in that bottom and you kind of reduces the energy at the top, that flattens this duck curve, this should be prioritized. Okay, I would say it should be up there with energy efficiency. Okay, because I'm kind of trying to treat this problem on a daily basis. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm still in the background phase. Just a couple more slides on this. When we look at the storage market, so storage does that shift, right? When we look at the storage market around the US, this is a US chart, we see something really interesting. Although commercial industrial customers are 50% of the power consumption, less than 1% of the storage assets are built in commercial industrial assets. So 90%-ish is front of the meter. 8% is residential. So in California and some other places, because we have some power reliability issues, people like to put their Tesla power walls of sorts. So and we got some tax incentives, so it created a market for that. But they're not used, mostly they're not used for the benefit of the grid. They're just sitting there as reliability assets. And if we look at the projection, so this is a very new projection from WoodMac, nobody is expecting C&I to play. I'm like, this is weird, right? You have the Googles, the Facebooks, the commercial buildings, the hospital, all of them. They're huge grid participants, and they're not playing in the storage game. So we're not building C&I energy storage. So this is like a fact. So people tell me, oh, we have, TOU rates. That supports. No, it doesn't. We have TOU rates for ages, and nobody's building energy storage in C&I. Oh, we have demand response. Nobody's going to build an energy storage asset to play 10 days a year. Okay, so we have this huge opportunity that all these buildings, if they're flat in their curve, and we can flatten any load, so we can flatten cooling loads, heating loads, electrical loads, you bring in your favorite storage technology, put it in, and now put it to use on a daily basis. And I mentioned this, the current grid utilization is 40%, and building assets front of the meter doesn't increase grid utilization. And we have to build it fast. So now, a way to do that is if we build assets behind the meter. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about specifically, people tell me, as I mentioned, shed DR is good. It's a solution. We can use shed DR to build energy storage assets. And let's talk a little bit about shed DR. And yeah, should I stop for questions in the middle or just at the end?
I think I don't see any questions
okay.
currently, but folks online, if you want to put questions in the chat, Will and I are monitoring those, and so we can interrupt you if it's
cool.
appropriate. I don't want to mess your flow. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about traditional DR and how we got there and why energy storage is fundamentally different as an asset and require something different than traditional DR. So shed DR, as I mentioned, has some negative impact on the customer. So we're asking the customer to do something. Maybe it's small, maybe it's like they don't feel it, but we're still bothering the customer. Maybe some reduced activity, something like that. The customer needs to respond and do something. As I mentioned, facility managers respond. Maybe it's automated even, but still they need to do something. And there's these effects. So typically you'd see, and it's been very widely researched, snapback and rebound and all these. So basically, they didn't cool the facility for a while. Now the event has ended. Everybody's starting to overcool, right, to compensate to get their facility back to a normal temperature. So all these phenomena that are widely, as I mentioned, researched. And customers get tired. So what happens is there's research about, okay, you call them one day, then you call them the second day, and like, no, we don't want to do that anymore. We're tired of this, helping the grid. The result is, and again, I look at it a lot from the Kaiser perspective or the system operator, is that it's not reliable. So if I'm if it becomes a behavioral science question, they might claim they're reliable. But now I'm the grid operator. I'm used to dispatching 300 megawatts, getting 300 megawatts. Now I'm calling this demand response program. It's warm today. Will the customers respond? Maybe yes, maybe not. So and with time, I kind of lose faith in this approach. The second thing is, DR has a problem, which we found a good solution to. Again, someone doing that for a while, is that we can't measure the reduction. It's like a philosophical question. So how do I measure something that you didn't do? And the other piece of information is that utilities only have access to the customer meters. So the one thing they can do is they can say, let's try to predict what you would have done if I didn't call you. Let's see what you actually did. And the difference would be your response to this demand response event. And this is actually a very hard question. Again, there's a lot of research on it. I don't need to harp on that. Okay, but all these so I can look back in the last 10 days and say, this is what your average behavior was. So that predicts your behavior for the next day. But the reason I'm calling a demand response event the next day is that it's not a normal day. Maybe it's really hot. So how do I predict how would you react on a hot day? So maybe I look at your response on the morning of. So all these mechanisms to improve these predictions. And they're actually not good for what's called highly variable customers. So let's say I want to ask myself, I called the stadium to participate in the demand response event. If tomorrow was supposed to be a game and they're shutting down a lot of load, then they gave a lot of response. But if tomorrow they're supposed to be shut down anyway because they don't have an event, so how do I deal with highly variable customers? Actually, no good solution for those. And the result is that it's always under compensating. That's kind of a fact. So nobody loves baselines, but we kind of got used to them. And the bigger thing, again, looking it back at the grid operator, so think about CAISO. We're dispatching power plants and getting all these. And now we call this whatever, utility program. And we said, OK, you promised me 50 megawatts, go. And then the day ends. And I'm like, how much did they get? And they'll say, we don't know. In 6 weeks, we'll gather all the data, and we'll let you know. Now, I'm a grid operator, and this is true. And then I was telling this at the kites yesterday. I said, no, it's 120 days. So how can you manage a grid? Think about it. You're trying to manage a modern grid. You're calling on a power plant, and the power plant is letting you know how much it delivered 120 days later. It's impossible. So then, why would the grid operator, again, not pointing to CAISO necessarily, like this resource? They'll tolerate it, but will they like it? Probably not. So that's another aspect of baselines. And then the third thing is, because we are used to devices or customers doing something special for us, we have this notion of incrementality. This is a very big notion, and it's like, okay, are you doing it especially for me? I'm paying you for this, so I want to make sure that if I didn't pay you, if I didn't ask you, you wouldn't do it. So all these questions that because we're not measuring, we want to make sure that we're treating this fairly. Now, let's take a step back and think about how, if I have a different underlying asset, these concepts change. Okay, so how would demand response look like if the underlying asset is not like me turning off the lights or increasing the temperature set point, if it's a storage device? Okay, so let's look at it. We look at it. So the first thing is, it doesn't impact the customer. So let's imagine an electrical battery. So I have a battery, and now I'm asking the facility to kind of get off grid, but it's getting all their electricity from the battery. Okay, so the customer doesn't feel, because they don't care where the electrons are coming from. They're getting from the battery, from the grid. They don't know. The electrons are electrons, right? Similar, when you're having your shower, if the water is warm, you don't care if it's made right now by the electric heater at this instant moment, or it was made 3 hours earlier, stored, and you're using this, you don't know, hot water. So it doesn't impact the customer. The next step is the customer doesn't care. So if I would tell you, hey, I'm controlling, you're getting, open the tap, get your hot water. Do you care when that water was made? Like heated, I don't care. Save me money, get me like cleaner carbon. So now the next step is, because they don't care and they're not impacted, they're willing to give a vendor or someone the keys to making the decision, because they're continuing to get their straight supply of whatever. And that results in that vendor being able to give the keys to the grid operator. So now the grid operator can tell you, hey, I have all these assets. I can charge and discharge whenever you tell me, because my customers trust me and they don't care. They'll continue, right? So if your EV was charged in the morning and your shower was warm and your building was cooled, yeah, sure, whatever, right? So keys can give, and then this increases our predictability, right? We can have a VPP that actually know exactly how much I can dispatch, how much I can, because it's not going to be impacted by some customer saying, nah, I don't want this now, didn't know. The second thing is, instead of these baselines, let's measure the load. So if I have a storage device and that storage is giving load to the building, I can measure that load, whether it's BTUs or electrons. I can directly measure them. So I don't need any baselines at all. Okay, the concept of why we used baselines in the first place doesn't matter, because this device is now giving me electricity. I can measure that today, yesterday, the day before. If it's an emergency tomorrow, I can measure it at those hours. I can measure it all the time, real time. And what it's giving is, by definition, the reduction, because again, it's not like this building is continuing to act as normal, and each kilowatt I supply to the building from my storage device is a kilowatt less that it took from the grid. So if I'm measuring that, that's by definition the reduction. And then there's this notion of incrementality. So let's imagine that I'm installing a storage device for this building, and the reason I'm installing this storage device is to serve the grid. There's some other reasons to do that, but that's the main reason I'll put this storage device in this building. And I'm telling the grid operator, dispatch it whenever you want. Today, dispatch. Tomorrow, dispatch. Tomorrow there's an emergency, dispatch. It's your resource. And they're going to be saying, no, we dispatched this device yesterday and the other day before. Why would we pay for doing it tomorrow? We're normally dispatching it. Like, what do you mean? Like, if there's a gas-fired power plant and you're dispatching it every day, you're paying for it every day. It's the same kind of concept. So this notion of incrementality, and this is, like, by the way, a real issue, we need to rethink about it, because we're actually distributing our power plant at the customer sites and dispatching them. Why would we tell our customers, don't dispatch it today because you dispatched it the other day and I'm not going to count it? And this is so baselines create a huge issue. Some utilities will do an annual kind of first year, and then they'll say that's your new baseline. But if I'm dispatching this every day, I'm looking at the whole facility meter as a baseline, then there's no reason to operate the storage device again. So we have to rethink how we do that. So if I compare, kind of put it on the table, traditional shed DR to storage-based, dispatchable load shift, we have a potential, in one, there's a few events, maybe up to 15. I've never seen programs that dispatch that much. It can be used daily. Is it predictable? Not really. Here, the forecasting is very accurate because I control the devices. Is it dispatchable? No, it may be automated. Some confuse it, but it doesn't mean it's dispatchable. So I'm kind of sending a signal, but don't really control it. It's dispatchable. Is the customer involved in traditional shed DR? Yes, no. Is the customer impacted? Yes and no. I can measure it directly, and the potential load is huge. So in DLS, we can take every building load. So I talk about commercial industrial, but it's true for residential as well. And put a battery on it and make it flat. Okay, or make it respond to intermittent renewables. This is huge potential. And it's distributed, so people can do that all at the same time. And they can do it with highly variable load. I don't care because I'm measuring the actual usage. Now, as I mentioned, in traditional shed DRs, there's many, many programs. Every utility has a few. There's not a single load shift program around the nation. Okay, so the next level of this, so people told me, okay, you're right, Boaz. Shed DR is the old school of thought, but for the last few years, the new school of thought, or a different school of thought, is pricing. Said, okay, you know what, you're right, let's put a price on energy, and that solves all our problems. Okay, because now people will be responding to the price signal, the market will sell the price, and everything is good and nice. And that's interesting, right? So I think, my personal view is that there's two types of assets, and we need to think about them. One are assets that customers buy anyway. So a thermostat, an EV, a fridge, people buy these assets, and now if I give them a nudge, in terms of a price signal, they'll make that asset participate. So if I'll tell them, look, it's going to be really expensive to charge your vehicle between 6 to 9 p.m., cheap at night, well, me or a vendor might respond to that. And that's a great driver. So I think, when people think about VPPs, they think about kind of this concept of let's put a pricing signal and make all these assets respond as a virtual power plant and all that. That's a great, awesome, seriously. But now there's a different type of asset that we're talking about is, okay, I want to potentially build a storage device, large storage device for this building, and I want it to participate daily so I can fund it. The building is not going to build a storage device for it because it doesn't have a good reason. But if they get it for free, or they get some paid a little bit for that, it's great because it gives them reliability, it reduces their carbon footprint, makes them money. But they won't build it if there's not a reliable source of income. So basically, this requires a predictable income for financing and bankability, and the price signal doesn't provide that in a good way, and it doesn't provide enough value. Like if we shift in pricing programs, it doesn't provide enough value. So if we kind of, again, similar comparison, the main issue with dynamic pricing on large storage devices is that it's not bankable. So I can't, like let's say I wanted to build an energy storage device here, and they'll say, the university would agree, and then I would go to a banker and say, hey, I want you to fund this energy storage device, and I'm going to pay back the loan. They're going to ask me, how are you going to make money? Like, oh, there's going to be a pricing signal, and there's going to be reliable income based on it. But they say, yeah, but that's the market mechanisms. Maybe a few years later, they'll be clear enough, but it won't be able to. The banks won't pay me for that. Think about the early days of solar, where you had to launch the market and creating these programs and these tariffs and to make it bankable so the developers can start building the industry. It's a similar comparison. So what we suggest is basically create a program that's similar to a DR program. It's managed by an IOU or a CCA or an LSE, single point of program management. You dispatch it daily and for emergencies. So as I mentioned, the balancing of the grid is a kind of a daily emergency. CAISO sees it as a real power plant, okay, or the grid operator. And it would look something like this. I won't go into the details too much, but very much how a DR program, an aggregator DR program looks like, just on a shift concept, on a daily concept. So last 3 slides and to summarize. So if we think about the different programs landscape, I encourage you to think about it from an asset perspective. Okay, so traditional DR, has 5 to 10 events a year. Typically, it's some kind of grid emergency or grid high usage, let's call it, not only emergency, like we can expect that high usage. And the assets that go in there are discretionary loads of sorts. And those loads are typically, lights, and I can dim the lights, and But ideally, with efficiency, by the way, you have less DR, right? Because the more you made your assets efficient, the less you can turn them off because you want to use them, right? So the owners goes to the customer. It's plateaued. So frankly speaking, in most places around the world where we have advanced grids, they have these demand response programs for 10, 15, 20 years. The participation is kind of flat. So we whoever can participate, participates, whoever doesn't want to participate, doesn't. And we can't expect that load to really grow in traditional DR. And there's many, many programs, as I mentioned. Dynamic rates is kind of what people talk about when they talk about VPPs. So they say, okay, all these assets, residential assets, we want them to participate, especially EVs, thermostats as well. Great stuff for them. Customer owns them. A pricing program, again, there's many types of designs. We'll get them connected. I believe in that. It will have its own, deployment schedule, or it'll take time, but it will happen. And there's, it can be daily. I'm not sure it will be because the vendors will get smart and only respond, when prices are high or I call it scarcity events. But if we manage the pricing in a way that induces daily behavior, it might be daily. And then there's shift. Daily, I think it should be actually first on the loading order. That we want to. So that's clean energy that we can dispatch in the afternoon, not a peaker power plant. So we want to think about it as clean energy that we're dispatching. The asset's primary use is to serve the grid. So we're building these assets, again, in the commercial industrial to serve the grid. Who would own them? It's a good question. LSCs can own them, maybe not right now, but maybe a potential aggregators can own them, developers, building owners. So depending on program, different people. The potential load growth is huge, so we can balance any building, pretty much. You measure it directly, and we need to create it. We need to make this happen. So we need to prove it out and show that this kind of program needs to work. So just a couple of summary slides. CNI not participating, new class of assets, allows for daily shift, huge potential. But what's more interesting, I didn't emphasize this enough until now, we can build this now. So we don't need any interconnection, no distribution. Like for thermal, you don't need any interconnection, any distribution. Even for a battery, if you size it the right way, you need minimal interconnection, let's call it. So you don't need to build out a distribution line to put that battery in. The funds exist. So just the problem is that they're just broken into so many buckets, and vendors can't get around those buckets. So one of the things the program does is concentrates those funds from different places. DR Shed's not going to do it, not going to build these resources. Dynamic Rates is not going to build these resources. So we need to develop a shift program. And I believe, personally, and also from what's seeing the industry, there's probably hundreds of energy storage technologies that are sitting on the sidelines, kind of waiting. So people would ask me, seriously, like other startups, oh, how do you make money? And it's hard. And again, we're not asking them to make money that's unfair. We're asking them to just provide their load daily, and then small amounts daily sum up the numbers. But if they do medium amounts 10 times a year, that's not enough. So, so if we build a shift program, I think all of this will come. And they have a bonus slide, like talked about that with Senator. Yeah.
Well, maybe we should open, is it okay?
Sure,
Let's
yeah.
open up. First of all, let's just thank you for putting this presentation together for us. So,
Thank you.
we have a number of folks online as well, and so there's already a couple questions. One is from your friend from PG&E, Sam Zimmerman. I presume you remember working with him.
Yes, of course.
But
Hi, Sam.
but Sam asked, and I think this is kind of probably to your, he made this question earlier on, but I think it's to your last point, which is what do you tell other storage companies, it's tough to make money. So the question is, any thoughts on why the thermal, in particular ice storage systems that have been around for a long time now, haven't become more popular? And then if you would, this is a question for your specific product and technology company, what's different about your product relative to those other?
I think they haven't become popular, and a lot of people would actually say these words, is that they didn't pencil out. So if I'm trying to provide a technology that works, but nobody's interested in using it, right, then it's not going to be popular. It's as simple as that, right? So if there's no reason for a building owner to install a technology that shifts the energy consumption, why would they do that? Now, what's changing is, in what we're doing, and I think other storage companies, not only us, are doing, is we're seeing this need for more shifting on a daily basis. We're working to put our assets in the energy market and make money that way. And that is, again, is approved and encouraged even by the different regulations. And in the last 10 years, we can control those assets daily and operate them on behalf of our customers. So when you put these tanks back in the day, 20 years ago, and you kind of gave the facility manager the keys, Sam, you know facility managers, no facility manager cares about when to operate this, when to freeze, when to discharge. This is on a daily basis, what? They'll never do that. And what used to happen is that these systems were installed because they got CapEx incentives. And then at some point, the controls of that kind of clock, let's say, broke, and then nobody fixed them because there wasn't an incentive. Okay, so we already got the CapEx. It's like a piece of equipment that I bought, and I don't care, but nobody else cares if I'm using it or not. So, I'm not using it. And this is all changing, right? Because if the daily incentive or the payment becomes based on my performance, then me as a company, I care. If my model is to give it to the customer for free as a CapEx incentive and then share the savings, I need to make sure there are savings to share, because otherwise I can't pay the loan and I can't pay my customer. So just the landscape has evolved. And then the other thing I mentioned is it's evolving also because, sorry, this is a long answer, is that there's a need for shift right now, right? There's a need for that. Yeah.
One follow-on question to that, and this is from Ryan Callahan. It's about, if you're looking at centralized storage, thinking about electric batteries, lithium-ion batteries are the big ones that are on the other side, the front side of the meter, right? And how does this differ, right? Precisely, it sounds like
it's a great question. So the main thing is on the grid utilization aspect. So storing energy in the front side of the meter is, again, it's another tool. It's not, when I'm saying we have to have, for this modern grid to work, all these things together. This is not an either or kind of thing. We have to have pricing programs and shed DR for those extreme events and front of the meter storage. The difference is that adding front of the meter storage doesn't solve your transmission distribution problem. So we need to get more electricity to the center of the cities. Putting the batteries on that side doesn't help with the grid utilization. So it helps with smoothing out, let's say we put it together with a solar power plant, it helps with smoothing out that, but the roads are still congested between 4 to 9, and I still need to drive the same roads. But if I took that solar, put it on the roads, the roads are the transmission lines, at 10 a.m. when they're free, stored it there. Now I don't care what's happening with the roads. So I'm using that free road at 10 a.m. And front of the meter storage doesn't increase grid utilization in that sense.
And then as part of that, you kind of alluded to the answer to this question. But Caton, who's listening in as well, and I'm glad to see that, is asking about CEC's DSGS program, which fits into that emergency kind of.
Yeah. So DSGS is, again, it's another great tool in the bucket. We look at its development. It's an emergency-driven program. So the philosophy behind it is for emergencies and not on a daily basis. So now, will a storage developer go and build a storage asset that's used just in emergencies? I'm not sure. So DSGS is seeing a lot of pickup, but a lot of that pickup is existing kind of assets that are finding this new revenue stream. And it's great for that. But does it go all the way to kind of, again, a lot of people, I assume economists, right? On the curve, will it go enough to incentivize the building of new assets? And I think no, and two, I think it doesn't get enough from the assets. So I think our goal as society or utilities or regulators, it should be, let's use those assets every day, not only in emergencies. So kind of always I'm looking at both sides. Let's utilize these devices all the time, and let's pay them for that. When those two things will match, and DSGS is just on the camp of, let's utilize them only in emergencies and just pay them only for emergencies. So they're not using them enough and they're not paying them enough.
And they're clean assets, so in theory, they should. The ideal would be to use them as much as possible.
Right.
Which is to your point.
Right.
So I'll ask another question.
It's a great program. Again, it's again for the certain. Yeah.
Paul,
Yeah.
Do you have a cost estimate of in comparison to say battery storage for your technology versus batteries?
Oh, this is a specific Nostromo's question. I think it's a good question, but I kind of want to go less into that in the DLS concept. The question is what's your all-in? The question we should ask is what's the all-in investment to make this building, grid interactive? Now, a battery has its associated costs. Would be insurance and fire hazards, and can you put it inside the building or outside the building, and and then both of those technologies will compare to what's the cost to increase the upgrade the distribution line to this building. So I'm just saying we need to do all these calculations on an all-in basis, and not sometimes people will say let's compare a battery to this technology, but a battery, same battery, you put it in the middle of nowhere, in a box outside, with some air conditioning, and you try to put that here in the city, same battery, it's a totally different game, right? You have it's yeah.
I think assuming that the demand pricing will actually be a motivator for commercial building owners when they're paying a dynamic price of 80+ cents a kilowatt hour for energy at specific times. They may say, you know what, it actually pencils out to get some sort of storage to shift that.
It's a good. I think that's the thought kind of leading that dynamic. But we see these building owners. It's not their game, And now the question is if vendors will step in, and to be kind of the intermediary. And I don't see that happening either because there's not enough money. They can do their math and it's not there.
So it's interesting just to build along that question, and I know we're coming up on the hour. Really appreciate kind of you providing a recording that our students can also reference because it's a really kind of great kind of perspective on it. But kind of this question about an asset that is basically paid for out of the market. Kaiso's buying that solar plus storage product, right? On the front of it, pre-transmission, pre-distribution, right? Versus the idea of having a program, so the LSE, the utility, the CCA, the POU, buying that asset, they're the ones paying for that asset, in theory, with subsidization from pricing, because they're getting the energy purchase as well, but putting it on the other side of the backside of the meter. That's kind of this big shift in thinking, right? And the question is, can those utilities that typically finance assets, energy assets, over a 20-year period, can they do something similar?
So I think the rules prevent them right now from owning assets behind the meter. But I think part of this new thinking is, okay, we have, the 15, 20 years ahead of how do we build this new resilient grid. I think what this is talking about is how do we create a new kind of program for this new asset class. And maybe in some places, utilities are allowed to own assets behind the meter. It's more of a regulatory question, that maybe in other places only market, owned. But I think I see it as distributed generation that happens to coincide with the customers. The customers are kind of giving their land, but it's not serving the customers. The customers are maybe they're getting rent. They're not even getting, the separate meters, and they're just getting rent for it, just like, solar was, once. So, and now who's owning it? It's a good question, but I'm more looking at how we operate it on a regular time, and I think many would want to own it because it's just like many want to own generation assets. It's a different kind of asset class. It's worth a little bit more because doesn't have to come with a transmission line that's attached to it. It doesn't have to come with a distribution line that's attached to it. So it's worth more in that sense. And now who owns it? That's the game begins, So yeah.
One additional question, and you get a chance to kind of talk about it, is demand charges.
Yeah.
The C&I space deals with that the way residential doesn't, right?
Yeah.
We don't have a demand charge for residential sector, but we do in the C&I sector. And if we are shifting, but we're not impacting our peak load at any one time, right? You could shift the peak, the load from, the time we don't want it, 6 p.m. or 8 p.m., and shift it to 10 a.m. or 12 noon. But if the peak stays the same, or even goes up, if you charge more during the day, you actually increase your demand charge.
True. So one of the things, I'm hoping to put out a paper about this is I think for this to work well, we should separate the metering of the system and the building. So the building will continue to have its own rate, meter, whatever, and they can continue to participate in Shed DR, for example, because they're just continuing their work normally. And now I can virtually sub-meter the storage device. And that storage device is now explicitly measured for the grid purposes. That solves a lot of issues like, okay, so now I'm not impacting the demand because it's measured separately. And it's easy to do, by the way. It's easily done with a sub-meter. Like we've solved bigger problems. So we can do that. And then facility stays in the same place. They're just hosting now a, demand side or behind the meter grid asset. And that asset is working for the grid. So yeah. But we can solve that. We can separate it because that, by the way, it's a concern. The reason you also need to separate it is because, again, example, the regulators are concerned by this kind of, they'll call it double counting. Like, oh, this asset got paid by the grid, but also reduced the demand charge of a customer. How does that work? I'm like, okay, let's separate those two. And now we don't have those concerns anymore.